Hello, and welcome to Trans Truth, the podcast dedicated to dispelling myths, fear, and ignorance about transgender people. Along the way, we'll be sharing items of interest to the transgender community, from political and news events to health, fashion, and beauty. And now, let's have a look at some news items that should be of interest to our listeners. More than 58,000 transgender youth in the U.S. are currently at risk of being stripped of medical support, according to a report released by the Williams Institute on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Law and Public Policy at UCLA. The report goes on to state that more than a third of the 150,000 transgender youth in the United States live in the 15 states that have restricted access to gender-affirming care or are currently considering laws to do so. About half of the laws proposed are also aimed at health insurance or state funding to prevent them from enabling accepted gender-affirming treatment. We put a link to this report in the description for this episode. The ACLU reports that they are tracking approximately 200 anti-trans bills across 30-some states. Close to home, the governor of Texas and his attorney general have tried to use what amounts to executive action to criminalize the provision of gender-affirming health care for minors. Fortunately, the courts have stepped in and issued injunctions against such action, arguing that continuing those investigations could cause irreparable harm. Much of that harm has already been done. At least 2 of the largest health systems in Texas have ceased the providing of such care, and thousands of families with trans kids now live in the very real fear of being torn apart by the actions of a cynical and desperate political party. See the link in the description of this episode for more. The Independent recently published a story wherein they've crunched the numbers on controversial trans swimmer Leah Thomas's performance. In short, the report puts the lie to the notion that girl or women athletes like Thomas enjoy an unfair advantage. Her performance, while impressive, is hardly a standout among collegiate athletes. The report is compelling in its analysis, but heavy with statistics, so we put a link to it in the description of this episode. And finally, as has been widely reported this week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has signed HB 1557, the Don't Say Gay bill, which will restrict educators in the state from discussing certain subjects, require those educators to notify a student's parents, quote, if there is a change in the student's services or monitoring relating to the student's mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being, unquote. On the bright side, CNN.com, link in the description, reports that Disney, the largest employer in Central Florida after initially declining to take a stand, has now publicly turned about. The company's CEO, Bob Chapek, apologized to his LGBT employees, stating, quote, you needed me to be a stronger ally in the fight for equal rights, and I let you down. I am sorry, unquote. The company has stated that it is dedicated to standing up for the rights and safety of LGBTQ members of the Disney family, as well as the LGBT community in Florida and across the country. So, okay, they were a little slow, but they're on the right track now. Hello, I'm Kelly Nelson, she, her, hers, welcoming you to this special edition of Trans Truth. As usual, I am joined by...
I'm Jerry Ann Young.
As you've just heard in our news segment, the widespread Republican strategy of attacking LGBTQ people, and trans kids and their families in particular, is still in full swing. This is not by coincidence. It is a part of a concerted national strategy of a morally bankrupt political party. There are at this time over 130 pieces of anti-LGBT legislation in 35 states. The majority of these bills are targeting trans kids and their families. This is not about protecting the children or ensuring fairness for female athletes, all for the sake of whipping up their right-wing extremist base. This activity is causing massive harm among an already vulnerable population. Now, just as we were sitting down to record this episode, Jerry Ann came up with a piece of breaking news. Do you want to share that with us?
I do. One of my news sources sent me this by email attachment this morning early, and it's a letter from the Department of Justice, and the letter is dated yesterday, March 31st, and the letter is composed and signed by Assistant Attorney General Krista Clark. Now, I've not verified this. This letter seems legit to me. It's got the Department of Justice seal. Seems legit in every way. But the way I understand it, this letter was sent to every attorney general in every state in the country, all 50 attorneys general. And basically what the letter says is that you can't pass laws that single out people. You can't interfere with parents seeking practiced medical treatment for their children. You can't pass laws that against someone because of their gender. Even if it's transgender, it's still gender. The letter speaks of Title IX, the Affordable Care Act, even Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. Now, again, I can read this entire letter. It's fascinating reading word by word, but I hate to take that much time because we have an amazing guest tonight.
We will put a link to that document on our website in the notes for this episode. So before we introduce our guest, I just want to point out a couple more things about the way that transgender kids suffer. 30% of foster kids are LGBTQ, and that begs the question, why? Those in the 15 to 24 age bracket who identify as LGBTQ are 120% more likely to become homeless than their straight peers. Again, why? How are these legislative efforts helping anyone but the cynical politicians putting them forth? So our guest tonight is going to answer a whole bunch of the legal questions, we hope, that the current legislation and recent actions by at least the Texas Attorney General. We are joined tonight by Danielle Healy. She is an attorney local to Houston who does a great deal of advocacy and pro bono work for the LGBTQ community. And her day job is as a patent and property attorney. Danielle, welcome to Trans Truth.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you, Jerry. I'm happy to be here. I haven't seen or heard of that letter yet, Jerry, but it certainly is interesting if it's the real deal.
Yeah, I'll forward a copy of it to you as soon as we finish this podcast.
Wonderful.
Well, what made us decide to basically bump Danielle up in our schedule? We had planned on having her on a little bit later in our series, but she called our attention to a move last week by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. I'll let Danielle give us the legal explanation of what it was, but basically Paxton has decided to take on Big Pharma, specifically the companies that manufacture gender-affirming hormones. Danielle, you want to talk about that?
Yes. Interestingly enough, what Attorney General Paxton has done is he has issued what's called a civil investigative demand. This is like a subpoena. It's a demand for documents or information from a party that's being investigated by the Attorney General. The Attorney General only has civil enforcement authority, so they're being investigated for the purpose of potentially bringing a civil lawsuit, not a criminal charge. And the service of the petition of this complaint was on, I believe, AbbVie, which makes hormone blockers, which are used to suppress puberty in trans kids until they're mature enough to make a decision, and Endo Pharmaceuticals, which also makes drugs that are used for puberty treatment. Now, these drugs are, as I understand it, their FDA-approved usages are in treating problems related to puberty, but the off-label use, and many drugs are commonly used off-label by doctors, is to use them to prevent trans kids from going into puberty until they're able to make a conscious decision of how they want to live, and that gives them an enormous advantage, because instead of going through, male puberty and then having to try to reconcile with the emotions and the trauma of going through that as a trans girl, they're able to bypass that. And if they are, as they appear to be and as they're diagnosed, truly trans, then they can go through a hormone treatment. And while they won't have the full-blown female puberty, they will develop much more in the form of females than as males. And the opposite is true for girls who are born biological female, but who are in fact trans boys and trans men.
Right. So he seems to be focusing on the puberty blockers. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's and this is in accordance with the declaration by the Texas Department of Child Protective Services that doing any type of interference with a minor's gender or providing any medical care to help a minor who's suffering from gender dysphoria or who's transgender is felony child abuse under Texas law. So he's going against the big pharma companies to try to make a statement, pound his drum, make a show, because he's gotten a lot of blowback, and I believe his direct efforts against children and parents have now been enjoined by the courts in Texas.
That's true. There is at least one lawsuit brought by the ACLU and Lambda Legal, if I'm not mistaken, that has resulted in an injunction against the state doing any further investigation of trans parents. But getting back to the puberty blockers, I wanted to make sure that everybody understands how important that is, because once a trans girl, a genetic boy, goes through male puberty, essentially irreversible changes take place. Beard growth, changes in their body, and their voice changing. Coming from the three lady baritones here, that's a tough thing to live with, a really tough thing to live with.
It is. And, also, I believe female hormones, when they're administered later, will prevent the biologically male children from reaching their full height or getting that male muscle development that is now the subject of these trans girls in sports complaints. So the bottom line is, if you have a trans girl who, say, since 5, 6, 7, 8 has been living as a female and socially transitioned and getting appropriate psychological and other care, when they get to be 12 or so, going through male puberty would be a nightmare. It would be emotionally devastating to them. And these puberty blockers prevent that from happening. And when the child has reached a stage of maturity where everyone's confident that this is the right thing to do, then they can move from the puberty blockers to the female hormones. Or if they're decided that this is not a transgender child and that they've made a mistake, they can go through male puberty.
Right. But that almost never happens.
I think it's very, very rare
Yeah.
For that to happen. And from what I've observed, it is truly an exception when you see a trans person who has made a transition, as hard as that is, who regrets it and wants to go back. I know many trans people, myself included, and certainly Jerry, for example, gave up quite a bit when we transitioned. And despite what we've given up, I know for sure I wouldn't go back.
I'm sorry, Jerry Ann, did you have something to add there?
I do. Let me reference this letter again. One paragraph in particular speaks of this whole medical issue, and I mentioned Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, but specifically it says it protects the civil rights of people, including transgender youth, seeking non-discriminatory access to health care in a range of health programs and activities. Categorically refusing to provide treatment to a person based on their gender identity, for example, may constitute prohibited discrimination under Section 1557. As the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has stated, restricting an individual's ability to receive medically necessary care, including gender-affirming care, from their healthcare providers solely on the basis of their sex assigned at birth or their gender identity may also violate Section 1557.
Wow.
And Jerry, that letter is on the internet on the Justice Department's website. I've sent you and Kelly a link to that website. So that letter is the real deal. And
okay.
It's nice to see. I think it puts a lot of caregivers and programs in a catch-22 situation. Kind of you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. But the result of failure to comply with federal law is often the loss of federal funding. And the loss of federal funding is a real threat as opposed to some hypothetical threat that, maybe not, this is child abuse, and maybe not, some local DA would prosecute you. For the institutions who are involved in this, the hospitals, the doctors, the schools, this position announced by the Biden administration in the March 31 Kristen Clark letter is very powerful. It's very powerful. For the individual parent, it provides comfort, but it still exposes them to whatever, the state agencies might try to bring about based on allegations of child abuse. It doesn't actually protect the individual parents or the individual child, but it does penalize or shows how it could result in significant penalties for schools, universities, hospitals, and other programs to discriminate against transgender kids.
So if I understand what you're saying, the hospitals and health systems that have already suspended care of transgender youth in Texas, at least, may be feeling some pressure from this letter.
I'm not a specialist on hospital law or federal benefits law, but typically the way a lot of federal regulation works is it's based on money. It's based on either the ability to regulate commerce or federal funding or federal taxes. And so when you see a federal law that sets up a regulatory system and you're threatened with violating that regulatory system, there's probably a financial risk involved, because typically financial concerns are what give the federal government the right to take these actions.
Right. So more on that as it happens, but that is an encouraging turn of events, to be sure. We talked about the injunctions brought by, or lawsuits that were brought by ACLU and Lambda Legal against Abbott and the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. When your executive orders, for lack of a better term, go against the standard of care established by the American Psychological Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics, isn't that kind of a shaky ground to be standing on legally?
Well, it certainly is contradictory to the way state regulation traditionally works. Traditionally, state regulation follows medical best practices from, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Pediatric Association. Here we have an unusual situation where the state has, in one sense, departed from that standard of care. Now, interestingly, it doesn't have anything, there's nothing the Texas State Medical Board has announced that I'm aware of, or the Texas Nursing Board has announced that I'm aware of. And so the state agencies that regulate the practice of medicine or the practice of nursing, they don't seem to have taken a position on this issue. Rather, it's the Department of Child Protective Services, as prompted by the governor, hence the Attorney General defending these policies in court, losing at the trial court, lost at the Court of Appeals, and now he's trying to get the Texas Supreme Court to take the case. And frankly, if the Texas Supreme Court takes the case, it's likely that they will reverse the lower courts, not because the lower courts are wrong, but because we've seen in the past, as in the Pigeon versus City of Houston case, where the Texas Supreme Court has been very vulnerable to political pressure and has given in to political pressure. In that Pigeon case, the Texas Supreme Court had originally denied review of a decision that permitted for same-sex healthcare benefits for City of Houston workers. And then after a hue and cry by Republican legislators, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and a series of amicus briefs from Republican officials and extremely conservative groups, the Texas Supreme Court did a complete reversal and flip-flopped on the issue and reversed the Court of Appeals and sent the case back to the trial court. And that's extremely unusual to have a motion for rehearing of a petition for review granted, and especially in a circumstance where you had a solid Court of Appeals ruling based on existing Supreme Court law. So that's a diversion, but that diversion is my way of saying that I don't have confidence that the Texas Supreme Court will stand up to the political pressure any more now than they did in the Pigeon case.
We keep coming back around to this being all about politics. Now, I don't know if the term standard of care is a legal term of art, but as a former healthcare provider, that term has a great deal of meaning. You do not deviate from a standard of care without having a very good reason.
And that's the standard for medical malpractice. So, in a sense, a doctor who is treating a transgender child, unless they withdraw from treating that child completely, is put in a rock and a hard place. And that is, do they violate the standard of care and withhold the gender affirming care that is recommended by the prevailing standards in the medical community, or do they give in to the fear that they could be found guilty of child abuse, potentially prosecuted, potentially lose their license. And that's why you're seeing hospitals close down their programs. Rather than try to walk that tightrope, hospitals are just closing their programs, as Texas Children's did, because it's you can't do this halfway without putting yourself either in violation of the standard of care or the Texas Department of Child Services pronouncements.
I want to say I can't believe it that we live in times when the caregivers of these kids are prevented from doing what they know is best. And make no mistake, all of the experts agree on the proper treatment for gender dysphoria. They're kept from doing that for political reasons. It boils my blood.
And it really is ironic to me that, the Republican Party, which is all about letting parents have choices and letting parents have authority over their children, such as with school voucher programs that they've advocated so that parents can choose what school their kids go to, that they are taking away the right of parents to consult with medical providers, to look at their kids, and to make the decision of what's best for their child. That's a huge contradiction from what we've seen in the past and what we've seen politically through the legislatures with these school voucher programs.
Okay, so we're all in agreement on how bad this is.
We've convinced ourselves. Three trans women have convinced themselves that this is a bad thing. So the choir has sung.
So what can our listeners do about this? What action can John Q. Public take?
I think the best action John Q. Public can take is at the ballot box, and that is in the next election to vote against candidates who support these policies, and instead to vote for candidates who say that they're going to oppose these policies. Another thing they can do if they don't have an opportunity to vote like that, or there are other things driving their ballot, is they can donate money to the ACLU and donate money to Lambda Legal. They can do that online very easily. And that money is enormously helpful and important to carrying on these legal fights, because even though they've got their own in-house counsel and they've got, I'm sure, help from other law firms that are doing this for free or pro bono, there's still a lot of expense involved and a lot of cost involved in pursuing any major lawsuit. So, make a donation. If you can't vote, for change, or you have issues in terms of voting for change, put your money where your mouth is and give to Lambda Legal or the ACLU.
Well, Danielle, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this and your time. One thing I forgot to mention in introducing Danielle is that she is a movie star. Actually, she and Jerry Ann. Danielle, tell us about your recent project.
We did make a movie about my transition, and that was filmed over a period of at least 3 years. And it shows how, we went from sort of a everything's rosy period in the beginning. In the beginning of my transition, I got a lot of support. I had ongoing business that I was going forward with, and just my family had stayed together, and everything seemed too good to be true. And turns out it was too good to be true, because within a year after I transitioned, I really had lost my business completely. I couldn't get hired by anyone to do anything. And it was really a shock for me that someone who had always been in demand and always had work to all of a sudden be, have nothing to do, and the financial ramifications of that. But, my wife and kids have always been supportive. And this movie, shows the trajectory of our transition. And it is a family thing. When you have a family, your whole family transitions. And, I was very fortunate that my wife, Becky, um, had the courage and the love to stand by me and to support me in this process. And she remains very supportive. And that, both my daughters have been very supportive. And, most of my family members have been very supportive. And that's made it a huge difference. I know other people, and of course, Jerry's story is very different. But a lot of what made this bearable and helped me live through, the loss of my practice and trying to reconfigure my life as a lawyer, is the love of my family and the support of my family in doing what was right for me. And that, frankly, had become, and I think they recognized it, become a do or die situation. And they'd rather have a live trans dad than a dead dad.
I go out on a limb here and say that Jerry Ann would probably echo the sentiment about it not really being a choice, about it being do or die. And that's so true for most trans women. You either live in misery or you don't, one way or the other. Does that cover it?
That's correct. I never wanted to be transgender. I was born that way. Wouldn't wish
Absolutely
it on it. Wouldn't wish it on an enemy. All I wanted to be was what other people would perceive as normal.
No one would choose this. This isn't something that people do to take advantage of some, special treatment that they think they're going to get. Transitioning is hard on you very emotionally. It's hard on you physically. It's hard on your family. And it makes life 10 times more difficult in the community, if not more. Being transgender is a physical issue. It's an issue that scientists now believe has its roots in the womb and in how babies develop in vitro. And in comparison to other conditions that scientists have seen, it is very much the same as people who are born with intersex physical attributes. Transgender people, typically, in my experience, from a very young age, know they're transgender. They know that, by 3, 4, 5 years old, that they're in the wrong body, and they then are in a lifetime of suffering. Today, we have parents who are willing to support their kids. And even that's not really a voluntary choice. I've worked on lawsuits with parents who are trying to support their kids. And quite often this is used as a wedge issue in a divorce. And what the story tends to be is that, for 2 years, say from the age of 4 to age of 6, you had this horribly depressed 4-year-old, this horribly depressed 5-year-old who's acting out and just being a miserable child and making other people around there miserable, and just a wretched situation. And then when the parent finally realizes that they've just got to let this kid be who they are, everything changes. Everything changes very, very quickly. And the kid becomes a loving, focused, productive child. And then, sadly, what we see in divorce is whether it's a wedge issue or closely held beliefs, one parent doesn't believe in providing the child with that kind of support, or believes the child should be forced to live according to their biological gender, as opposed to their true nature.
Right.
And when I say biological gender, that's a misnomer, because I think transgender is your biological gender. Um,
Yeah.
it is not something that's chosen. It's something that you're born with. And so these kids suffer greatly. And when they get caught in the middle of divorce, they suffer greatly. Today we have medicine, we have psychiatrists who are able to help these kids and basically steer them to a normal life, or as normal a life as a transgender person can have. And it's horrific when they become pawns in a divorce, or pawns in politics.
That's the point I wanted to bring home here as we start to wrap up, is that it is not a choice. A parent who is seeking gender affirming care for their child is doing the right thing for their child. They are not trying to make them be something they're not. It's not a fad, despite all of the disinformation out there. I know that Jerry Ann's done probably more research than the two of us put together on the biological nature of transgenderism.
And most parents come to this very slowly. It's not like parents say, oh, good, my kid wants to be a girl. I always wanted to have a girl. It's typically a couple of years of hell for the family, until finally, the parents recognize that the only way their child is going to make it is if they allow their child to be who the child is. And it's traumatic for the family. It's traumatic for the parents. And I've never heard of a parent who was able to accept this from day one. It's always been a process.
It's getting better. For those of our generation, it wasn't anywhere close to as good as it is now, as far from perfection as we were, right, Jerry Ann?
That's right. Even the process was not a possibility for me. I was born transgender. Don't want to be transgender. It caused me misery all my life. My world that I grew up in would not accept me being transgender. I would have been beaten. I would have been kicked out of the house, just like a lot of trans women have been. And I held off as long as I could. But, you made a good point earlier, DJ. You can be a trans dad or a dead dad. It gets to that point. I have an online friend who expresses it as wringing out a towel. In her male life, it was like wringing out a towel, and she kept wringing and wringing and wringing, and finally she couldn't get any more out of the towel. She just dropped the towel and became Michelle and found inner peace. Her whole life blew up in her face. Everything went to pots. When I came out to my daughter, she said, "It's okay. We still love you. Things will be different, but they will be good." But unfortunately, I haven't heard from that daughter in 4.5 years. So you're right, DJ. We give up a lot. But yeah, I didn't want to close without mentioning that the documentary that you are in, we're in, DJ.
We're both in, yes.
Yeah, has received, I think, 4 awards. 1 at the Vail Film Festival, 2 at the Portland Film Festival, and 1 in Manchester, England.
Yes, it has. It's in every one of the 3 festivals where it's been featured. It has won awards, and in the Portland Film Festival, which is a very significant film festival here in the United States, it won both the Audience Choice Award, which is typically considered the highest award for any movie, and that's when there were some movies that it was competing against that had Hollywood personalities in them, and then it won the LGBTQ Voices Award. In Manchester, it won the Best Documentary Award, and that qualifies the film to be considered in the British Independent Film Awards, a qualification process, festival, or awards program that requires entrants to have won awards at certain designated festivals in England as a condition to enter that contest. We're hoping that it will soon be film festivals in the U.S., and that ultimately it will get, some type of distribution in the U.S. where people will be able to watch it streaming online or in some other readily accessible form, because it tells a story, and it tells it from different points of view of different people, and I think it helps people to understand our lived experience.
I've been lucky enough to see the film during during its run at one of the film festivals. It's an amazing piece of work. So keep your eyes on this spot. As soon as it becomes available wherever, we will make an announcement so our listeners will be able to take advantage of that. Danielle, once again, thank you so much. In closing, I've got just one more piece of news to share and a quote. Sadly, last week we lost former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and a friend recently shared a quote from Ms. Albright, which sums up nicely, I think, the reason that we here at Trans Truth do what we do. The quote reads, "The temptation is powerful to close our eyes and wait for the worst to pass. But history tells us that for freedom to survive, it must be defended, and that if lies are to stop, they must be exposed." Once again, on behalf of Jerry Ann and myself, thank you so much for listening. We'll see you again soon.